What if the most profound relationship of your life wasn't with another person, but with a part of yourself you've never truly met? Imagine for a moment that within you exists a hidden aspect of your personality, an inner opposite that holds the key to your wholeness, creativity, and deepest fulfillment. In the words of Carl Jung, the great explorer of the human psyche, the encounter with the shadow is the apprentice piece in the individual's development, but that with the anima or animus is the masterpiece. I'm your name, and today we continue our journey through Jung's revolutionary work, Man and His Symbols, with what might be his most transformative insight, how reconciling with our inner opposite unlocks the pathway to our authentic self. In our previous exploration, we ventured into the shadow, those rejected aspects of ourselves we hide from consciousness. Today we go deeper, beyond the personal unconscious, to discover what Jung called the archetype of life itself. By the end of our time together, you'll understand how integrating your inner opposite creates a profound psychological transformation. You'll discover why Jung believed mandalas appear spontaneously at moments of breakthrough, and most importantly, you'll gain practical insights to advance your own journey toward wholeness. Are you ready to discover the masterpiece of psychological development? Let's begin. The journey of individuation begins with a startling recognition. Within every man dwells a feminine soul, and within every woman, a masculine spirit. Jung discovered this universal pattern through decades of clinical work, dream analysis, and his own profound inner journey. In Man and His Symbols, Jung calls this feminine aspect in men the anima. For women, the masculine counterpart is the animus. These aren't simply gender stereotypes or cultural constructs. They are primordial patterns that transcend the personal psyche, rooted in what Jung called the collective unconscious, that vast reservoir of shared human experience that unites us all. What makes this discovery so revolutionary is that these inner figures are autonomous, living aspects of our psyche that influence our lives whether we're conscious of them or not. For men, the anima represents what Jung called eros, the principle of relationship, emotional connection, and the very essence of life itself. For women, the animus embodies logos, the principle of reason, judgment, and meaning. And here's where it gets truly fascinating. Jung observed that these inner opposites serve as bridges between our conscious personality and the deeper collective unconscious. They are messengers between worlds, bringing vital energy and wisdom from the depths. But when we remain unconscious of these inner figures, they don't simply disappear. Instead, they emerge in our lives through projection. We see them embodied in others, particularly those we fall in love with or intensely dislike. Think about it. Have you ever been intensely drawn to someone who embodies qualities you lack? Or perhaps you've been inexplicably irritated by certain traits in others, traits that represent aspects of yourself you've never acknowledged. I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment. In Man and His Symbols, Jung explains how the anima typically appears in men's dreams as a single woman, while the animus often appears to women as a group of men or a single authoritative male figure. Think about your own dreams. Have figures of the opposite gender appeared? What forms did they take? What qualities did they embody? When we remain unaware of these inner figures, something profound happens. We don't experience them directly. Instead, we project them onto others. As Jung writes in Man and His Symbols, the effect of projection is to isolate the individual from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is now only an illusory one. This explains why relationships can feel so magical at first, and then so disappointing. Initially, we see our inner opposite embodied in another person. The intense attraction we feel isn't just to them, but to our own unrecognized wholeness. But no real person can perfectly embody our inner anima, or animus. Eventually, reality breaks through, projections fade, and disillusionment follows. This is why Jung considered the integration of these inner opposites to be essential for mature love. We must withdraw our projections and recognize these aspects within ourselves. What quality of the opposite gender do you most admire? This might offer a glimpse of your own anima or animus. Stages of anima and animus development. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes a remarkable discovery. The integration of the inner opposite follows a developmental path with distinct stages. These stages aren't merely theoretical. Jung observed them repeatedly in dreams, fantasies, and the psychological development of his patients. For men, the anima development progresses through 4 archetypal stages. First, there is Eve, the purely biological feminine, representing instinctive connection and the mother archetype. At this stage, a man's relationship with women is largely defined by his mother complex. Second emerges Helen, named after Helen of Troy, representing romantic and aesthetic qualities. Here, the feminine takes on beauty and allure, but still lacks depth. Third comes Mary, the spiritual feminine who brings emotional depth, devotion, and meaning. At this stage, a man begins to value women beyond physical appearance, appreciating their spiritual and emotional qualities. Finally, there is Sophia, wisdom itself. At this highest level of integration, the anima becomes a guide to inner wisdom, creativity, and meaning. Jung observed that great artists and visionaries often achieved this level of anima development. For women, the animus development follows a parallel path. It begins with embodiments of physical power and strength, often projected onto athletes or action heroes. Next comes the man of action and independence, the romantic adventurer who takes initiative in the world. The third stage manifests as the bearer of the word or meaning, professors, clergy, or intellectual figures who articulate ideas and values. In its highest development, the animus becomes the mediator of spiritual meaning and purposeful action in the world, what Jung called the inner significance. Now, I want you to consider this profound question. Which stage of anima or animus development resonates with your current life experience? Are you still primarily experiencing your inner opposite through projection onto others? Or have you begun the process of recognition and integration? The answer isn't about judgment, it's about awareness. Because awareness is the first step toward transformation. And that's not even the most fascinating part of Jung's discovery. The dangers of possession. Jung warns us in Man and His Symbols about what happens when we fail to integrate these inner opposites. He called it possession, where the unrecognized anima or animus takes control of our personality in negative ways. A man possessed by his negative anima becomes moody, irrational, and emotionally reactive in destructive ways. As Jung describes, he may become childish, sentimental, dependent and submissive, or rebellious, tyrannical, and hypersensitive. You likely know someone like this. Perhaps a man who throws emotional tantrums becomes irrationally jealous or seems unable to handle emotional situations with maturity. For women, animus possession manifests differently. A woman possessed by her negative animus becomes rigidly opinionated, argumentative, and coldly judgmental, expressing absolute certainty without real understanding or emotional connection. Jung explains that the animus collects all the half-truths and prejudices from the conscious mind and takes possession of the judgment throne. This possession isn't rare. It's a common experience when these powerful archetypes remain in the unconscious. But Jung discovered something truly revolutionary. The more conscious we become of these inner figures, the less power they have to possess us. Integration begins with recognition, acknowledging these aspects of ourselves rather than seeing them only in others. But here's where it gets truly interesting. This integration doesn't mean a man becomes feminine or a woman becomes masculine in stereotypical ways. Instead, a man develops his capacity for relationship, emotional depth, and intuitive wisdom while remaining fully masculine. A woman cultivates her capacity for decisive action, clear thinking, and principled judgment while remaining fully feminine. The goal isn't to become more like the opposite gender, but to become more fully human, to reclaim aspects of our wholeness that cultural conditioning has severed from consciousness. Let me share a powerful example from Jung's clinical work described in Man and His Symbols. Jung tells of a highly intellectual professor who prided himself on his rational thinking. This man began experiencing disturbing emotional outbursts and dreams of a mysterious woman who both attracted and terrified him. In analysis, Jung helped him recognize this figure as his own neglected anima, his emotional and intuitive nature that had been repressed for decades beneath his rational persona. As the professor began to acknowledge and relate to this inner feminine aspect, his dreams changed. The woman became less threatening and more guiding. His emotional life stabilized, his creativity flourished, and remarkably, his relationships with actual women improved dramatically. This transformation didn't happen through intellectual understanding alone. It required a profound shift in his relationship with his own depths. The path to integration. How do we undertake this masterpiece of psychological development? Jung offers several pathways described in Man and his Symbols, each representing a different approach to the same essential process of bringing the unconscious into relationship with consciousness. Let's explore each of these methods in depth. Active imagination. First is active imagination, perhaps Jung's most revolutionary contribution to depth psychology. This method emerged from Jung's own inner work during his profound psychological crisis following his break with Freud. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes how he developed this approach by allowing his conscious mind to engage directly with the figures and images arising from his unconscious. This isn't passive fantasy or daydreaming. It's a structured dialogue between the ego and autonomous figures from the unconscious, including the Anima or Animus. The process begins with a quiet, meditative state where you focus inward. Then, you allow an image or figure from a dream or fantasy to appear in your imagination. Instead of merely observing this figure, you engage it in conversation. You ask questions and listen for responses that emerge spontaneously, not from your conscious thinking, but as if from the figure itself. This dialogue can happen through internal conversation, through writing in a journal, where you write both your questions and the figure's responses, or through artistic expression, where you allow the figure to guide your creative process. Jung discovered that when approached with sincerity and respect, these inner figures respond with surprising autonomy and wisdom, often providing insights your conscious mind could never reach alone. One of Jung's patients described this experience. It was as if I was speaking with another person inside myself, one who knew things I didn't know and saw connections I couldn't see. This process creates a bridge between conscious and unconscious, gradually integrating aspects of the psyche that were previously split off or projected. Dream work. Second is dream work, the royal road to the unconscious, as Freud called it, but with Jung's unique approach. In Man and His Symbols, Jung emphasizes that dreams aren't merely disguised expressions of repressed desires. They are natural communications from the unconscious, speaking in the language of symbols. When working with the Anima or Animus, Jung encourages special attention to opposite gender figures in dreams. These figures are not representations of actual people, but symbolic manifestations of your own inner opposite. The key is to approach these dream figures with curiosity, rather than interpretation. Instead of immediately translating the dream into intellectual concepts, Jung suggests relating to these figures as if they were real beings with their own purpose and message. Ask yourself, how do I feel about this dream figure? What qualities does it embody? What is it trying to communicate to me? Jung observed that as integration progresses, these dream figures transform. Initially, they might appear threatening, seductive, or primitive, but as conscious relationship develops, they become more positive, more individuated, and more guiding. One remarkable pattern Jung documented was the appearance of wedding imagery in dreams as integration advances, symbolic representations of the inner marriage between conscious and unconscious, between masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche. Third is the challenging work of withdrawing projections, perhaps the most difficult but transformative aspect of this journey. Jung observed that unconscious aspects of ourselves don't simply remain dormant in the psyche. They are projected outward onto people and situations in our lives. This is particularly true of the Anima and Animus. Men project their unrecognized Anima onto women. Women project their unrecognized Animus onto men. These projections create both intense attraction and intense irritation. The qualities we most admire in others often represent positive aspects of our inner opposite that we haven't claimed for ourselves. The qualities that most irritate us often represent negative aspects of our inner opposite that we reject. Withdrawing these projections doesn't happen through intellectual understanding alone. It requires emotional recognition, the honest acknowledgement that what I see in you is also in me. Jung described this process as both liberating and disorienting. Liberating because we reclaim aspects of our wholeness, disorienting because it challenges our established sense of identity. As projections are withdrawn, relationships transform. We no longer burden others with carrying parts of our psyche. We see them more clearly as they are, not as carriers of our projections. This brings profound freedom, both for ourselves and for those we love. Fourth is creative expression, using art, writing, music, movement, or other creative activities to give form to the inner energies of the Anima or Animus. Jung was himself a prolific artist, creating hundreds of paintings and drawings as part of his own individuation process. His famous Red Book contains stunning visual expressions of his inner journey. In Man and His Symbols, Jung explains that creative expression provides a container for unconscious content, a bridge that allows psychic energy to flow from unconscious to conscious in a structured way. This isn't about creating polished art in the conventional sense. It's about authentic expression that bypasses the censoring intellect and allows unconscious content to take visible form. Jung observed that many patients experienced breakthroughs when they stopped trying to understand their inner process intellectually and instead expressed it creatively. One remarkable example from Man and His Symbols involves a highly intellectual man who made no progress in therapy until Jung suggested he try painting. Despite having no artistic training, the man began creating images that gave form to his inner conflict. Through this creative process, he established connection with his anima that had eluded him through years of intellectual effort. The key to all these approaches is developing a conscious relationship with these inner figures, not identifying with them, but not repressing them either. This relationship requires a delicate balance. If we identify with the anima or animus, we become possessed by it. If we repress it, it controls us from the unconscious. Jung called this middle path the confrontation with the unconscious, a dialogue between our conscious personality and these autonomous aspects of our psyche. As he writes in Man and His Symbols, the confrontation with the unconscious must become a dialogue. This dialogue requires someone who can address and be addressed, in short, a consciousness. This dialogue isn't always comfortable. It challenges our sense of who we are and confronts us with aspects of ourselves we may have spent decades denying. The process often triggers what Jung called the night sea journey, a period of disorientation and darkness as the ego surrenders its absolute control and enters into relationship with the larger psyche. But the rewards are profound. As Jung writes, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. By integrating these aspects, we no longer blindly project them onto others or act them out unconsciously in our lives. We gain psychological freedom and depth. The ultimate goal isn't to eliminate the anima or animus by absorbing it into consciousness. Rather, it's to establish an ongoing relationship with these inner figures, a dynamic dialogue that continues throughout life. This relationship becomes a source of wisdom, creativity, and wholeness. The integrated anima helps a man connect to his emotions, intuition, and capacity for relationship. The integrated animus helps a woman express her ideas, take action in the world, and stand on principle. Together, they create what Jung called the transcendent function, a new center of personality that transcends and includes both conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. What aspect of your inner opposite have you begun to recognize in yourself? This recognition is the first step toward integration. Energy, transformation. Jung discovered something remarkable about the integration of the anima or animus. It releases tremendous psychological energy that was previously locked in unconscious conflicts. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes this using terminology borrowed from physics and Eastern philosophy, the transformation of psychic energy, or what he called libido. Unlike Freud, Jung saw libido as a broader life energy, not merely sexual in nature. This energy flows through our psyche, and when blocked by unconscious conflicts, it creates psychological symptoms, anxiety, depression, or neurotic behaviors. The integration of the inner opposite creates a profound shift in how this energy moves through the psyche. The river system of psychic energy. Think of your psychological energy like a river system. When dams block the natural flow, pressure builds up behind them. Some areas become flooded while others suffer drought. Integration removes these dams, allowing energy to flow naturally throughout the entire system. Jung observed this process repeatedly in his clinical work. Patients who had suffered from energy-depleting symptoms, chronic anxiety, compulsive behaviors, emotional numbness, experienced a remarkable renewal of vitality as integration proceeded. One patient described it as a fountain suddenly flowing after years of drought. Another spoke of lights coming on in rooms of myself that had been dark for decades. This energy transformation isn't merely subjective. Jung documented observable changes in his patients' lives: increased creativity, improved relationships, greater emotional resilience, and a renewed sense of meaning and purpose. 3. Manifestations of transformation. This transformation manifests in three powerful ways. Dream transformation. First, in dreams. Jung observed that as integration proceeds, dream imagery changes dramatically. The threatening or seductive opposite gender figures become more positive and guiding. Dreams become more balanced, often revealing symbols of wholeness. In Man and His Symbols, Jung documents the dream progression of a middle-aged man who initially dreamed of a dangerous, seductive woman trying to drown him in dark waters, a classic negative Anima figure. As therapy progressed, this figure gradually transformed. In later dreams, she appeared as a guide helping him navigate those same waters, revealing hidden treasures beneath the surface. This transformation wasn't merely symbolic. It reflected a profound shift in the man's relationship with his own emotional depths. Creative awakening. Second, in creativity. Jung noted that patients integrating their anima or animus often experienced a surge in creative energy and expression. This isn't surprising when we consider that the anima and animus serve as bridges between the conscious mind and the collective unconscious. That vast reservoir of images, patterns, and potentials that transcends individual experience. As these bridges strengthen, creative inspiration flows more freely. Men become more intuitive and emotionally expressive, women more assertive and focused in bringing their ideas to fruition. Jung himself experienced this creative awakening during his confrontation with the unconscious. After years of scientific writing, he began producing artwork, symbolic writing, and eventually his monumental Red Book, a creative expression that emerged directly from his engagement with the Anima, their unconscious figures. Third, in relationships. As we withdraw projections and recognize these aspects in ourselves, our relationships transform from unconscious projection to conscious connection. Jung observed that many relationships begin with powerful projection. We see our inner opposite embodied in another person, creating an almost magical attraction. But as the relationship continues, these projections inevitably falter against reality. No actual person can perfectly embody our inner anima or animus. This explains the common pattern of idealization followed by disillusionment in relationships. Initially, we project our inner opposite onto our partner, seeing them through the lens of our unconscious needs and images. Eventually, reality breaks through, projections fade, and disappointment follows. But when we undertake the work of integration, something remarkable happens. We no longer need others to carry our projections. We can see them more clearly as they are, not as carriers of our unconscious content. This creates the possibility for what Jung called conscious relationship, connection based on reality rather than projection. One of Jung's patients described this transformation. For the first time, I feel like I'm seeing my husband as he actually is, not as what I needed him to be. And surprisingly, I love the real person even more than the projection. The energetic paradox. One of Jung's most profound insights about this energy transformation is what we might call the energetic paradox. Logically, we might expect that withdrawing energy from projections would leave us feeling depleted or diminished. If we're no longer fueling our fantasies and projections, won't we feel less intensity, less passion? But Jung observed precisely the opposite. As projections are withdrawn and energy is redirected inward toward integration, patients reported feeling more alive, more passionate, and more engaged with life. This paradox reflects a fundamental principle of Jungian psychology. Authentic connection with the unconscious increases the energy available to consciousness. When energy is no longer being drained into unconscious conflicts and projections, it becomes available for conscious living. The result isn't diminishment, but enlargement, a more vivid, energized experience of life. But here's what Jung found most fascinating about this energy transformation. It often coincides with the spontaneous appearance of certain symbols in dreams and creative work, particularly the mandala, the circle with a center representing wholeness. Jung discovered that his patients would spontaneously create or dream of mandalas precisely at moments when this integration was occurring, without any prior knowledge of these ancient symbols. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes a remarkable case. A woman with no artistic training or knowledge of Eastern spirituality began spontaneously drawing circular patterns during a critical phase of her therapy. These mandalas appeared at exactly the moment when her dreams showed a new relationship forming between her conscious personality and her previously projected animus. Jung was astounded by this correspondence. How could patients with no knowledge of these ancient symbols spontaneously produce them at precisely the same stage of psychological development? This led to one of Jung's most profound insights. The integration of opposites within the psyche follows universal patterns across cultures and time periods. The mandala isn't merely a cultural symbol, but an archetypal expression of the psyche's movement toward wholeness. As Jung writes, the mandala is not a mere reflection of a pre-existing order, but a creative reordering of a chaotic psychological state. This creative reordering represents the essence of the energy transformation we're exploring. Psychological energy that was previously fragmented or in conflict configures around a new center, the emerging self, the physical dimension. Jung also observed that this energy transformation often has physical manifestations. As unconscious content is integrated, many patients reported changes in their somatic symptoms. Chronic tension patterns release. Sleep deepens and becomes more restorative. Energy levels stabilize rather than fluctuating wildly. Psychosomatic symptoms diminish or disappear. This mind-body connection reflects Jung's holistic understanding of the psyche. The integration of the anima or animus doesn't just affect our thoughts and emotions, it transforms our entire being, including our physical vitality. One patient with chronic digestive issues that had resisted years of medical treatment found these symptoms gradually resolving as she integrated previously rejected aspects of her animus. As she described it, it was as if my body had been holding these tensions that my mind refused to acknowledge. This physical dimension of transformation highlights an important aspect of Jung's approach. True integration isn't merely intellectual understanding. It's a whole being process that encompasses mind, emotion, and body. As Jung wrote, the symbols of the self arise in the depths of the body. The energy transformation we're discussing isn't abstract theory, but lived experience that affects every dimension of our being. This brings us to what might be the most beautiful and mysterious aspect of Jung's discoveries about energy transformation, its connection to meaning. Mandala, symbol of wholeness. As integration of the anima or animus progresses, Jung observed a remarkable phenomenon, the spontaneous appearance of circular images in dreams and art. Jung called these images mandalas, adopting the Sanskrit word meaning magic circle. In Man and His Symbols, Jung explains, the mandala is an archetypal image whose occurrence is attested throughout the ages. It signifies the wholeness of the self. Jung's discovery of mandalas. What makes this discovery so profound is that Jung's patients created these circular symbols without any knowledge of Eastern spiritual traditions, where mandalas had been used for centuries as meditation tools and spiritual symbols. Jung first encountered mandalas in his own psychological journey. During a period of profound inner turmoil following his break with Freud, Jung began spontaneously drawing circular images each morning. As he later wrote in his autobiography, my mandalas were cryptograms concerning the state of the self which were presented to me anew each day. He found that creating these images had a calming, centering effect during a time of psychological disorientation. Initially, Jung didn't understand the significance of these drawings. It wasn't until he began studying Eastern spiritual traditions and encountering similar circular symbols that he recognized their universal nature. But the crucial insight came through his clinical work. Over decades of treating patients, Jung observed this same pattern repeatedly. At critical moments in the integration process, circular symbols would appear in dreams or creative expression, without any suggestion from Jung himself. Jung documented numerous cases in Man and His Symbols. One involved a middle-aged businessman with no artistic interests who began dreaming of circular patterns during a crucial phase of therapy. Another featured a young woman who spontaneously began drawing mandalas during her recovery from a psychological crisis. What astonished Jung was the timing of these spontaneous mandalas. They typically appeared during periods of psychological reorientation, precisely when the psyche was reorganizing around a new center. The structure of mandalas. The mandala typically contains several key elements that Jung identified as symbolically significant. The circle. The circle itself represents wholeness and completion, the totality of the psyche that includes both conscious and unconscious elements. Unlike the limited perspective of ego consciousness, the circle encompasses the entire psychological field. As Jung writes, The circle is one of the most primitive expressions of wholeness, appearing in the earliest cave drawings, in sun symbols across cultures, and in the first drawings of children. The circle's lack of beginning or end symbolizes the eternal nature of the self. It exists beyond the linear time experience of the ego. The center. At the heart of the mandala is its center point, symbolizing the self as the organizing principle of the entire personality. This center is distinct from the ego, which is merely the center of consciousness. Jung observed that in psychological development, the center of personality gradually shifts from the ego to the self, creating a new psychological organization that transcends, yet includes, ego consciousness. In many mandala dreams, this center appears as a divine figure, a jewel, a star, or some other symbol of supreme value. Jung interpreted these as representations of the self-archetype emerging into consciousness. Quaternities. Jung was particularly fascinated by the frequent appearance of fourfold patterns within mandalas, what he called quaternities. These take many forms: 4 directions, 4 colors, 4 figures, 4 divisions of the circle. In Man and His Symbols, Jung connects these quaternities to the psychological need for completeness and balance. 4 represents stability and wholeness, encompassing all aspects of a system. Jung observed that these fourfold patterns often represented the integration of functions of consciousness, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, or the balance of elements needed for wholeness, symmetry and asymmetry, while mandalas generally display symmetrical patterns. Jung noted that therapeutic mandalas often contain small asymmetries or imperfections. Rather than seeing these as flaws, Jung interpreted them as signs of the living, developing nature of the psyche. Perfect symmetry, he observed, often appeared in mandalas created during psychological rigidity or inflation. The slight asymmetries in genuine therapeutic mandalas reflected the ongoing, imperfect nature of the individuation process. Look closely at these mandala images Jung collected in Man and His Symbols. Notice how they appear across cultures and time periods, from Tibetan Buddhism to Christian art, from ancient alchemy to modern psychological patience. Each culture may give these images different interpretations, but the underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent: a circular form organized around a significant center. Jung saw this as evidence of the universal patterns in the collective unconscious, the shared symbolic language of human psychological development, the psychological function of mandalas. But the mandala isn't merely a symbol to be observed. Jung discovered it serves profound psychological functions: containment during chaos, during periods of inner turmoil or disorientation, particularly when the psyche is integrating previously unconscious material. The mandala appears as a protective circle, a container for the transformation process. As Jung writes, the mandala is an image which tries, through its richly symbolic content, to bring order out of the multitude and confusion of conflicting tendencies. One patient described creating mandalas as building a safe harbor in the middle of a storm. Another spoke of feeling held together by the circular form when everything else seemed to be falling apart. This containment function proves especially important during major life transitions or psychological crises, the very moments when our previous psychological organization no longer serves and a new configuration is emerging. Bridge. Between conscious and unconscious, Jung also recognized that mandalas serve as bridges between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Their symbolic nature allows them to represent both rational, conscious understanding and the irrational, mysterious elements of the unconscious. In creating or contemplating mandalas, we engage both sides of our nature simultaneously: the ordering, structuring function of consciousness and the creative, symbolic function of the unconscious. This bridging capacity makes mandalas particularly valuable in the integration of the Anima or Animus, which themselves serve as mediators between conscious and unconscious. Transformation of energy. Perhaps most profoundly, Jung observed that mandalas serve to transform psychological energy. The circular movement represented in many mandalas through spiral patterns or orbiting elements symbolizes the circulation and transformation of psychic energy. This connects to ancient alchemical concepts of the circular distillation, the idea that psychological transformation requires energy to circulate through all aspects of the psyche, rather than becoming fixed in partial positions. As Jung writes, the circulation gives the idea that by going around in a circle, the unio mystica will be established, as in the symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent biting its own tail. Jung encouraged his patients to create mandalas as part of their therapeutic work. The creation process itself serves to center and organize the psyche during transformation. He emphasized several key principles in this process. Spontaneous creation. Jung insisted that therapeutic mandalas should emerge spontaneously rather than being copied from existing designs. The value lies not in reproducing culturally sanctioned patterns, but in allowing one's own psyche to express its current state and movement toward wholeness. As he writes, mandalas are not created by a conscious effort of the ego, but emerge from a deeper layer of the psyche. Non-interpretive approach. Unlike other symbolic work, Jung recommended minimal intellectual interpretation of one's mandalas. Rather than analyzing them, he suggested simply creating them and observing how they change over time. This non-interpretive approach preserves the mandala's function as a direct expression of the self, rather than reducing it to conceptual understanding. Tracking the process. Jung found great value in creating series of mandalas over time. These series often revealed the unfolding individuation process with remarkable clarity, showing development, regression, breakthrough, and integration through their changing forms and colors. One patient created mandalas weekly for over a year. The progression from chaotic, fragmented early images to increasingly integrated, harmonious later ones provided a visual record of her psychological journey. Jung's study of comparative religion and mythology revealed the universal presence of mandala symbols across cultures. In Tibetan Buddhism, elaborate mandalas serve as meditation tools and representations of the cosmos. In Hinduism, yantras, geometric designs, function as focusing devices for spiritual practice. In Christianity, the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals embody mandala principles, as do the halos surrounding Christ and saints in religious art. Native American medicine wheels, Celtic stone circles, and the zodiac wheel all express this same fundamental pattern, the circle organized around a significant center. Jung saw these cross-cultural parallels as evidence that the mandala represents something fundamental to human psychological development, not merely a cultural invention, but an archetypal expression of the psyche's movement toward wholeness. As he writes, the mandala symbol is not only a means of expression, but works as an active factor in bringing about the transformation it expresses. Modern applications. Jung's insights about mandalas have found applications far beyond analytical psychology. Art therapy routinely employs mandala creation as a centering practice for clients experiencing anxiety, fragmentation, or life transitions. Mindfulness practices incorporate mandala contemplation as a focusing technique that promotes psychological integration. Organizational consultants use mandala principles to create balanced, centered organizational structures. Educational approaches apply mandala creation to help students integrate learning across disciplines. This wide-ranging influence speaks to the profound relevance of Jung's discoveries about this universal symbol. If you were to create a mandala representing your current psychological state, what would be at its center? What colors and symbols would appear? Approaching the self. The integration of the anima or animus serves a greater purpose in Jung's psychology. It is a crucial step on the path to what he called the self. In Man and His Symbols, Jung defines the self as not only the center but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. This is a profound distinction that represents one of Jung's most revolutionary contributions to psychology. While our ego is the center of our conscious awareness, our sense of I, the self is the center and totality of our entire psyche, encompassing both conscious and unconscious dimensions. Jung identified the self as the central archetype of the collective unconscious, what he sometimes called the archetype of wholeness. Unlike other archetypes that represent specific aspects of human experience, mother, hero, trickster, the self represents the totality of the psyche and its potential for integration. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes the self as having both personal and transpersonal dimensions. On one level, it represents our individual wholeness, our unique potential fully realized. But on another level, it connects to something beyond the individual, what various traditions have called the divine, the absolute or ultimate reality. This dual nature makes the self both the goal and the guiding force of individuation. It represents what we are becoming while simultaneously guiding the process of becoming. As Jung writes, the self is not only the goal of individuation, but also the agent that guides the process. This paradoxical quality, being both destination and guide, distinguishes Jung's concept from more linear models of psychological development. Manifestations of the self. Jung discovered that the self manifests in dreams and visions through specific archetypal images that appear with remarkable consistency across individuals and cultures, divine or numinous figures. The self often appears as divine or extraordinary figures that transcend ordinary human limitations. These may be explicitly religious figures, Christ, Buddha, or mythological beings, divine kings and queens, immortal sages. Significantly, these figures often transcend gender polarities, representing the union of masculine and feminine principles. Jung saw this as symbolic of the integration that the self embodies, the reconciliation of opposites within the psyche. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes a patient's dream of an androgynous divine figure that appeared at a crucial moment in her therapy, precisely when she was integrating aspects of her animus and moving toward greater wholeness. Quaternities and mandalas. As we explored earlier, fourfold patterns, quaternities, and mandala symbols frequently represent the self. The quaternity symbolizes completeness and balance, while the circle with center represents the totality of the psyche organized around its true core. Jung was particularly struck by how these symbols appear across religious traditions. We'll see from the Christian cross, with its 4 arms, to the Buddhist mandala with its 4 gates, from Native American medicine wheels to ancient Greek cosmologies with 4 elements. Animals of wholeness. Certain animal symbols appear consistently as representations of the self, particularly those that embody power, wisdom, or integration. The elephant, lion, or great bear may represent the powerful, instinctual aspect of the self. The wise serpent or owl may embody its wisdom. The dragon or phoenix often represents its transformative nature. Jung was especially interested in animals that unite opposing qualities: the lion eagle, griffin, the winged serpent, or the double-headed eagle, seeing these as representations of the self's capacity to unite opposites. Precious objects. The self frequently appears symbolically as objects of extraordinary value: jewels, gold, or other precious substances. Jung interpreted these as representing the inestimable value of authentic selfhood. In alchemical symbolism, which deeply influenced Jung, the philosopher's stone represents this same principle, the precious substance that emerges from the integration of opposites. One patient dreamed of a diamond at the center of a mandala during a crucial phase of integration. Jung saw this as a perfect symbol of the self, precious, indestructible, and formed under tremendous pressure. The psychological journey toward the self. As we progress in integrating the anima or animus, our relationship with the self transforms. Jung observed distinct phases in this development. Initial unconsciousness. Initially, the self remains largely unconscious. We live primarily from our ego identity, perhaps with occasional glimpses of something larger through peak experiences, deep creative moments, or spontaneous religious feelings. During this phase, self-qualities are primarily projected outward, onto religious figures, idealized leaders, or other carriers of our unrealized potential. These projections create a sense of meaning but keep us separated from direct experience of our own wholeness. Awakening to the self. The journey of individuation involves gradual awakening to the reality of the self as distinct from both ego and projections. This awakening often begins through dreams, synchronicities, or creative expressions that cannot be understood within our previous psychological framework. Jung describes this awakening as both wondrous and disorienting. It brings a sense of meaning and purpose, but also challenges our established identity and security. One patient described this awakening as the shocking recognition that I am both more and less than I thought I was, less in my ego's importance, more in my connection to something vaster than I'd imagined. The ego-self relationship. A crucial aspect of approaching the self involves establishing a proper relationship between ego and self. Jung emphasized that this relationship is not one of ego dissolution but of conscious dialogue and service. The ego remains essential as the center of consciousness and agency in the world. But rather than being the ultimate authority, it becomes the executive organ of the larger self. Jung used various metaphors for this relationship: the ego as satellite orbiting the self, the ego as emissary carrying out the self's purposes, the ego as lens focusing the light of the self into conscious awareness. This relationship transforms our experience of identity. We no longer feel our ego is the totality of who we are, yet we don't lose our individual uniqueness. Instead, our uniqueness becomes an expression of something larger than personal identity. Living from the self. As this relationship matures, we begin living more directly from the self as the center of personality. Jung observed several characteristics of this shift. We experience more moments of meaningful coincidence or synchronicity, where inner and outer reality seem to align in purposeful ways. Dreams become more numinous and meaningful, often providing guidance that transcends our conscious understanding. A sense of purpose emerges that feels both deeply personal and transpersonally significant. Creativity flows from a deeper source than ego ambition or cultural conditioning. Relationships become more authentic as we project less and see others more clearly. Ethical awareness shifts from rule-following to an organic sense of right action, emerging from wholeness. A natural balance develops between opposites, between doing and being, between individual needs and collective responsibilities, between rational analysis and intuitive knowing. The dangers along the path. But this journey toward the self isn't without challenges. Jung warns of two primary dangers that often arise. Inflation. The first danger is inflation, identifying with the self and falling into grandiosity or messianic fantasies. This occurs when the ego assimilates self-content without maintaining proper boundaries. Jung observed this danger particularly in individuals with fragile ego structures or those raised in environments that encouraged special status. The inflated individual feels godlike, beyond ordinary human limitations and ethical constraints. Jung describes numerous historical and clinical examples of inflation, from cult leaders claiming divine status to patients experiencing messianic delusions during psychological crises. The antidote to inflation is what Jung called conscious suffering, the humble acknowledgement of our human limitations even as we connect to something beyond those limitations. The second danger is dissolution, the ego becoming overwhelmed by unconscious content, leading to psychic fragmentation. This occurs when the boundary between conscious and unconscious becomes too permeable without sufficient ego strength. Symptoms of dissolution include overwhelming anxiety, loss of reality testing, inability to function in daily life, or confusion between inner and outer reality. Jung emphasized that approaching the self requires a strong, flexible ego capable of relating to powerful unconscious content without being overwhelmed by it. This balance, strong enough to not be overwhelmed, flexible enough to not be rigid, develops gradually through the individuation process. The path requires balance, respecting both conscious and unconscious, both ego and self. Jung emphasized that individuation has an essential ethical dimension. It isn't merely about self-development, but about becoming a more complete human being in relation to others and to life itself. As Jung writes, the goal of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona and the suggestive power of primordial images. This divesting creates authentic relationship with both inner and outer reality, freeing us from unconscious projection and compulsion. Far from being self-centered, true individuation leads to deeper connection with others. As Jung observed, the more we become conscious of ourselves through self-knowledge, the more we become genuinely connected to others. Beyond personal development, Jung's vision of approaching the self transcends contemporary notions of personal development or self-improvement. It isn't about creating a better, more successful ego, but about establishing a living relationship with the transpersonal center of the psyche. This relationship transforms not only the individual, but potentially society itself. Jung believed that genuine psychological transformation of individuals was the only sustainable basis for social and cultural renewal. As he writes toward the end of Man and His Symbols, the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. This statement isn't about self-absorbed individualism, but about the profound recognition that collective transformation begins with individual consciousness. When enough individuals undertake the journey toward the self, cultural and social patterns can transform from their roots. This is the essence of Jung's vision, not transcending the ego, but placing it in proper relationship to the larger self, and through that relationship, creating the possibility for both personal wholeness and cultural renewal. Such a vision offers a profound response to the alienation and fragmentation of modern life, not through escape from the human condition, but through deeper entrance into its mysteries and potentials. A case study from Man and His Symbols. To illustrate this remarkable journey toward wholeness, let me share one of Jung's most revealing case studies from Man and His Symbols, a case that demonstrates the integration of the Anima, Animus, and the emergence of the self through the symbolic language of dreams and creative expression. The woman with the threatening animus Jung describes a middle-aged woman who entered analysis during a profound life crisis. She was highly educated and successful in her professional life as a university professor, specializing in philosophy and logic. She prided herself on her rational thinking, intellectual accomplishments, and fierce independence. On the surface, she appeared confident and self-sufficient, a model of achievement and autonomy. But beneath this capable exterior, she suffered from profound psychological distress. Emotionally, she experienced a persistent inner coldness, an inability to form deep connections with others despite her desire for relationship. In her personal life, she had a pattern of attracting domineering, critical men who initially impressed her with their intellect, but ultimately became controlling and dismissive. She suffered from recurring anxiety dreams in which she was pursued by threatening male figures, sometimes a gang of criminals, other times a single dangerous man who seemed intent on harming her. Physical symptoms manifested as chronic migraines and digestive issues that had resisted years of medical treatment. Her initial goal in seeking therapy was straightforward: eliminate the anxiety dreams and physical symptoms that were disrupting her life. She had little interest in deeper psychological exploration, viewing it as mystical nonsense compared to her rational philosophical training. The negative Animus Constellation. Through careful work with her dreams and life history, Jung helped her recognize these threatening dream figures as representations of her own animus, her inner masculine nature that had developed in a negative form. Her personal history revealed the origins of this negative Animus constellation. She had grown up with a brilliant but tyrannical father, a mathematics professor who valued intellectual achievement above all else. He had treated emotional expression as weakness and criticized any show of feminine sentimentality. As a girl who adored her father and craved his approval, she had unconsciously modeled her animus on his critical, judgmental qualities. She had learned to repress her emotional nature and identify with masculine rationality to earn his validation. This negative animus manifested in several ways. Her inner dialogue was filled with harsh self-criticism, a constant voice telling her she wasn't good enough despite her achievements. She approached relationships intellectually rather than emotionally, analyzing people instead of connecting with them. She held rigid, absolute opinions on philosophical matters, while remaining disconnected from lived experience. Her anxiety dreams revealed the psychological truth she couldn't consciously acknowledge, that her identification with this negative animus was actually threatening her wholeness and well-being. The dream progression. As therapy progressed, Jung documented a remarkable transformation in her dreams. Through the symbolic language of these dreams, we can trace the process of animus integration and the gradual emergence of the self. The initial dreams, persecution and threat. In the early phase of analysis, her dreams consistently featured threatening male figures from whom she fled in terror. In one dream, she was pursued through dark city streets by a gang of men with knives. In another, she was trapped in her childhood home with a sinister male intruder trying to break into her room. In a third, a cold, mechanical man with a metallic voice was interrogating her about her failures. Jung interpreted these dreams as symbolic representations of her relationship with her own animus, when she was literally running from the masculine aspect of her own psyche, experiencing it only as threatening and persecutory. The middle phase, confrontation and recognition. After several months of therapy, a significant shift occurred in her dreams. The male figures still appeared, but the nature of the interaction changed. In one pivotal dream, she stood her ground against a threatening man and asked, "Who are you, and what do you want from me?" To her surprise, he responded, "I've been trying to give you something, but you keep running away." In another dream, she encountered a male teacher who resembled her father but spoke with unexpected gentleness, showing her a text she couldn't quite read. In a third, she found herself in a classroom where a male professor was teaching about the integration of reason and emotion, a lecture she found both irritating and strangely compelling. Jung saw these dreams as representing a new phase in her relationship with the animus, moving from flight to confrontation, from projection to dialogue. The Animus was beginning to transform from a purely threatening figure to one who might have something valuable to offer. The breakthrough dreams, transformation and gifts. Approximately a year into analysis, she experienced a series of breakthrough dreams that signaled a profound transformation in her Animus relationship. In one remarkable dream, a wise old man resembling a combination of her father and Jung himself presented her with a golden key. When she asked what it opened, he replied, "The door to understanding both your mind and your heart." In another dream, she encountered a young man who resembled her younger brother, with whom she had always felt a deep connection. He guided her through a beautiful garden to a circular pool in which she saw her reflection. But in the reflection, she was both male and female, harmoniously combined. In a third significant dream, she found herself in a laboratory where a scientist was demonstrating the transformation of lead into gold, the classic alchemical process that Jung associated with psychological transformation. Jung interpreted these dreams as representing the positive transformation of her animus, from persecutor to guide, from critic to teacher. The golden key symbolized the key to integrating her animus in a positive form. The androgynous reflection represented the emerging harmony between masculine and feminine aspects of her psyche. Shortly after these breakthrough dreams, the woman began spontaneously drawing circular patterns during therapy sessions, classic mandalas. She had no prior knowledge of Eastern spiritual traditions or Jung's work with mandala symbolism. When Jung asked about these drawings, she said simply, "I feel compelled to draw these circles. They give me a sense of peace I've never experienced before." The progression of these mandalas over several months told the story of her psychological transformation. Her first mandalas were asymmetrical, with sharp divisions between dark and light sections and an unstable center. Gradually, the mandalas became more balanced and integrated, with complementary colors and patterns that flowed together harmoniously. In later mandalas, a clear, stable center emerged, often containing a symbol of wholeness like a flower, jewel, or balanced quaternity pattern. Jung observed that these mandalas appeared precisely when her psyche was reorganizing around a new center, when the self was emerging as the organizing principle of her personality. As the integration process deepened, the woman began experiencing what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seemed to connect her inner and outer worlds. She reported 3 particularly striking incidents. After a dream about a rare butterfly, she encountered the exact species the following day in a park she had never visited before. She spontaneously picked up a book in a bookstore that contained passages remarkably relevant to her current psychological process, addressing exactly the questions she had been contemplating. She met a new colleague who, without any prior knowledge of her therapy, gave her a small gift of a circular medallion with a balanced pattern of symbols that closely resembled one of her recent mandalas. Jung saw these synchronicities as manifestations of the emerging connection between consciousness and the deeper self, moments when inner and outer reality aligned in meaningful ways that transcended causal explanation. The psychological integration manifested in concrete changes in the woman's physical and emotional life. Her chronic migraines diminished significantly and eventually disappeared entirely. Her digestive issues resolved without further medical intervention. She reported feeling emotionally thawed, experiencing a range of feelings that had been unavailable to her for decades. Her relationships transformed as she withdrew projections and related to others from a more integrated place. She became capable of genuine intimacy for the first time in her adult life. Most remarkably, her intellectual work deepened rather than diminished. Rather than abandoning her philosophical interests, she found a new dimension in them, connecting abstract concepts to lived experience in ways that enriched both. What Jung found most significant about this case was what he called the inner marriage, the woman's development of a harmonious relationship between the feminine and masculine aspects of her psyche. She no longer experienced her rationality and emotionality as opponents in an internal war. Instead, she developed what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension, generating a third position that transcended both. This inner marriage manifested in several ways. She became both logically rigorous and emotionally attuned, using each capacity to complement the other. She developed a balanced relationship with power, neither dominating nor submissive, but appropriately assertive and receptive, depending on the situation. Her creative work began integrating both analysis and intuition, producing insights that neither approach alone could generate. She developed what Jung called symbolic consciousness, the ability to recognize and value both literal and symbolic dimensions of experience. Jung used this case to illustrate several key principles of the individuation process. The integration of the anima, or animus, follows a developmental progression that can be traced through dreams and creative expressions. Psychological symptoms often represent the psyche's attempt to communicate imbalance and initiate healing. The mandala emerges spontaneously as a symbol of the self precisely when psychological reorganization is occurring. Integration doesn't mean abandoning our strengths, but complementing them with previously undeveloped aspects of our potential. The reconciliation of opposites within the psyche creates a new center that transcends and includes both conscious and unconscious elements. This case demonstrates the essence of Jung's approach, not treating symptoms in isolation, but understanding them as part of a meaningful pattern of psychological development toward greater wholeness. The woman herself described her transformation most eloquently. Near the end of her therapy, she told Jung, "I always thought wholeness meant perfection, achieving some ideal state. Now I understand it means embracing all of myself, my strengths and limitations, my rationality and my emotions, my masks and my depths. For the first time in my life, I feel like a complete human being." The journey toward wholeness. As we conclude our exploration of Jung's masterpiece of psychological development, let's integrate what we've discovered about the individuation process and the reconciliation with the anima or animus. The path we've traveled. Throughout our journey today, we've explored the profound map Jung created in man and his symbols, a map not of external territory but of the inner landscape of psychological development. We began with Jung's revolutionary discovery of the inner opposite, the anima in men, the animus in women, autonomous figures within our psyche that serve as bridges between consciousness and the collective unconscious. We examined the dangers of remaining unconscious of these figures, how they manifest through projection onto others, creating both our most powerful attractions and our most intense conflicts. We traced the developmental stages these inner figures undergo, from primitive instinctual forms to highly developed spiritual guides as integration proceeds. We explored Jung's practical methods for integration, active imagination, dream work, withdrawing projections, and creative expression, each offering a different pathway to the same essential goal. We witnessed how this integration transforms psychological energy, releasing vital force previously locked in unconscious conflicts and redirecting it toward wholeness and creativity. We discovered the mandala as the universal symbol of the self, appearing spontaneously at moments of psychological integration across cultures and throughout history. We contemplated the emergence of the self as the goal of individuation, not merely an improved ego, but a new center of personality that transcends and includes both conscious and unconscious elements. And through Jung's detailed case study, we observed this entire process unfolding in the life of an actual individual, from unconscious projection to conscious relationship, from fragmentation to wholeness. From this exploration, three essential insights emerge that capture the heart of Jung's vision of individuation. First, wholeness requires the integration of opposites. True psychological development isn't about perfecting our conscious attributes, but about embracing the complementary qualities we've excluded from consciousness. For men, this means integrating the feminine qualities of the anima, emotional sensitivity, relational capacity, and intuitive wisdom. For women, it means integrating the masculine qualities of the animus, logical clarity, principled action, and autonomous judgment. This integration doesn't diminish our primary gender identity, but enriches it with the full spectrum of human potential. Second, integration transforms psychological energy. When we reconcile with previously rejected aspects of ourselves, we release tremendous vitality previously consumed by internal conflicts and projections. This liberated energy becomes available for creative expression, authentic relationship, and meaningful engagement with life. The result isn't a diminishment, but an enhancement of our capacity to live fully and purposefully. Third, individuation leads toward the self as the new center of personality. As Jung writes, the goal of the individuation process is the synthesis of the self. This synthesis creates a new psychological organization in which the ego remains essential, but no longer central, serving as the conscious agent of the larger self that embraces both conscious and unconscious, both personal and collective dimensions of the psyche. Beyond theory, living application. But this isn't merely abstract psychology. It's a living path toward becoming more fully human, toward embodying your unique potential in all its depth and dimensionality. Imagine for a moment how your life might transform as you continue this journey. Imagine relationships freed from the burden of unconscious projection, where you see others clearly for who they are, rather than as carriers of your own unrecognized potential. Imagine creative energy flowing from a deeper source than ego ambition, connected to the wellspring of authentic inspiration that Jung called the collective unconscious. Imagine a sense of meaning that transcends circumstance yet remains grounded in daily life, neither lost in spiritual abstraction nor trapped in materialistic limitation. Imagine the capacity to embrace both masculine and feminine qualities within yourself, strength and vulnerability, logic and intuition, independence and connection, creating a wholeness that transcends gender stereotypes while honoring the unique gifts of your gender identity. Imagine discovering, as Jung wrote, that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This vision of psychological development offers a profound response to the fragmentation and alienation of modern life. In a world that often splits reason from emotion, body from spirit, individual from community, Jung offers a path of reconciliation and wholeness. But this path isn't walked once and completed. Individuation is a lifelong process of becoming, a spiral journey that returns to similar themes at deeper levels of integration throughout our lives. As Jung writes in Man and His Symbols, there is no linear evolution. There is only a circumambulation of the self, a gradual circling approach to our own center and wholeness. The journey continues in our next exploration, where we'll discover how Jung's symbolic understanding manifests in visual art across cultures and time periods, exploring how artists throughout history have given form to the same archetypal realities we've examined today. Before we conclude, I want to share a reflection that captures the heart of Jung's vision, words he wrote toward the end of his life that express the essence of the individuation journey. The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. Only if we know that the thing which truly matters is the infinite can we avoid fixing our interest upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals which are not of real importance. If we understand and feel that here in this life we already have a link with the infinite, desires and attitudes change. This link with the infinite isn't found by escaping our humanity, but by embracing it fully, by integrating all aspects of our nature into a coherent whole that reflects our unique expression of universal human potential. What has been your most meaningful insight from today's journey? What aspect of Jung's vision resonates most deeply with your own experience? Remember, the path of individuation isn't walked alone. We journey together, each in our unique way, toward the same destination, the discovery of our authentic self.